Hey guys! Tonight we're stepping into a world where the smell of fresh bread doesn't mean comfort, it means danger. You're standing in a medieval marketplace at dawn, watching a baker's apprentice tremble as the town magistrate weighs his master's loaves on a great bronze scale. The crowd gathers, silent. One loaf comes up short by barely 2 ounces. The magistrate's face hardens. By week's end, that baker will stand in the pillory, pelted with rotten vegetables. By month's end, if he's unlucky enough to cheat the scales again, he'll hang. This isn't fiction. This is the bizarre, brutal reality of medieval Europe, where bread, the staff of life itself, became a battleground between survival and the gallows. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why our modern laws about food safety feel so strangely excessive, or why we still use phrases like upper crust to describe the wealthy. So, before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Maybe tell me where you're watching from tonight, or what time it is in your corner of the world. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo is drifting off to these same words while someone in Oslo is just beginning the evening wind down. Now, let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're living in 1266 in a cramped half-timbered house that leans so far over the cobblestone street you could shake hands with your neighbour across the way without leaving your window. The air smells like wood smoke, horse manure, and that yeasty promise of baking bread that makes your stomach growl even though you ate an hour ago. But here's the thing about medieval bread, it's not just food, it's currency, it's politics, it's literally a matter of life and death. When a peasant wakes before sunrise to knead dough, when a housewife counts out her pennies for a loaf at market, when a baker lights his oven, they're all participating in one of the most tightly regulated, viciously enforced systems the world has ever seen. The medieval fixation on bread wasn't arbitrary paranoia. You have to understand that bread provided somewhere between 50 and 70% of the average person's daily calories. Historians still argue whether the actual figure skewed higher for the poorest classes, but everyone agrees mess with the bread supply and you mess with civilization itself. A kingdom could survive a bad king, endless wars, even plague, but let the bread fail, and you'd have riots in the streets before sunset. So the authorities watched bakers the way modern governments watch nuclear facilities. You're walking to the market square now, your wooden clogs clicking on the stones, and you notice something peculiar. Every single loaf being sold has a mark on it. Not just any mark, a specific stamp, pressed deep into the crust, identifying exactly which baker made it. This isn't branding for marketing purposes. This is forensic evidence. If someone gets sick, if a loaf weighs wrong, if the texture seems off, the authorities can trace it back to one person's oven, one person's hands, one person's neck. Let me paint you a picture of John the Baker, because he's real, or at least composite of dozens of real Johns whose names appear in medieval court records. John rises at 3 a.m. because his oven takes 2 hours to reach proper temperature. He's using wood that he had to purchase at regulated prices from licensed woodcutters. Yes, even the fuel was regulated. His flour came from a miller who ground grain that farmers grew under rules dictating what could be planted where. John doesn't get to decide how much to charge for his bread, doesn't get to decide how much it should weigh, he doesn't even get to decide what shape to make it. All of this was determined by something called the Assize of bread, and breaking those rules could cost him everything. The quirky detail that most people miss. The punishment often matched the crime in almost poetic ways. A baker who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets, tied to a sledge with the offending loaf hung around his neck. There's a dark humour in medieval justice that feels almost theatrical, as if the punishment needed to tell a story the illiterate crowd could understand without words. You cheat with bread, you become the bread. You become the thing everyone points at, the cautionary tale, the object lesson baked in humiliation rather than flour. You're watching John now as he carefully weighs each loaf on his own scale, and you can see the sweat on his forehead, even though dawn is still cool. He's not sweating from the heat of the oven. He's sweating because he knows that the town's official inspector could arrive any moment with the public scales, the ones that matter. And if there's a discrepancy, if his scale is even slightly off, he won't be able to claim ignorance. The medieval justice system had zero tolerance for "I didn't know" or "it was an accident." Intent barely mattered. The crime was in the deed itself. What's fascinating is how bread laws intersected with almost every other aspect of medieval life. You couldn't just wake up one day and decide to become a baker. You needed to join a guild, serve an apprenticeship that could last 7 years, pay fees, swear oaths, and submit to inspections not just of your bread but of your moral character. The guilds maintained that baking was a sacred trust, literally sacred, because bread was the body of Christ in communion, and symbolically sacred because bread kept the kingdom alive. A bad baker wasn't just a criminal, he was almost a heretic, someone who violated both earthly and spiritual order. Do you remember the last time you complained about a restaurant serving small portions? That impulse? That sense of being cheated by food that doesn't meet expectations? That runs deep in human psychology? Medieval people felt it 1,000 times more intensely because they lived so much closer to hunger. Most people were perhaps 3 missed meals away from genuine starvation, especially in winter or during bad harvests. So when a baker shorted the weight of a loaf, he wasn't just being greedy, he was stealing life itself from people who had almost nothing to spare. The authorities understood this rage, this potential for bread riots, and they channeled it into legal structures that would make modern health departments look relaxed. You had bread inspectors who would arrive unannounced at bakeries. You had public weigh-ins at market. You had informants' neighbours who would report suspicious baking activities for a share of the fine. The whole system ran on mutual surveillance, everyone watching everyone else. Because bread was too important to trust to individual honesty. You're standing in Westminster in the year 1266, inside a stone chamber where King Henry III's advisors are drafting a document that will haunt bakers for centuries. The Assize of bread and ale isn't just being written, it's being calculated with an almost obsessive precision that would make modern economists weep with envy. A clerk scratches numbers onto parchment by candlelight, his quill moving in careful strokes as he works out mathematical formulas, connecting the price of wheat to the required weight of bread loaves. This isn't guesswork. This is social engineering on a scale that seems almost impossible for the medieval mind. Except here it is, happening right in front of you. The word assize itself comes from the Latin assidere, meaning to sit beside or to assess. You're watching the birth of price controls, of consumer protection law, of the idea that government has not just the right, but the duty to regulate what you eat and what you pay for it. The logic seems straightforward enough. Wheat prices fluctuate with harvests, weather, and warfare. If bakers could charge whatever they wanted, they'd gouge the poor during famines and grow fat on suffering. So the Crown decides to fix the equation. When wheat costs this much per quarter, bread must weigh that much per penny. It's elegant in theory. In practice, it becomes a nightmare of enforcement. Here's where it gets mathematically beautiful and humanly terrible at the same time. The assize tables don't just set one price point, they create a sliding scale with extraordinary detail. You're looking at charts that specify different weights for white bread, wheat bread, and dark bread, the whitest bread, made from bolted flour with all the bran removed, could be sold at a higher price per weight because the processing cost more. The darkest bread, made from flour that included everything, had to be heavier for the same price because it was cheaper to produce. But here's the kicker: the authorities built in a profit margin for bakers called the advantage. This advantage was supposed to cover the baker's costs, labour, and a modest profit. Historians still argue whether this advantage was generous or stingy, with some evidence suggesting bakers regularly went broke trying to comply. You're in a bakehouse now, watching a master baker explain the system to his new apprentice. The boy looks confused, and honestly, you don't blame him. The baker is saying that when wheat sells for 6 shillings per quarter, a farthing loaf of the finest white bread must weigh exactly 17 shillings and 8 pence worth of wheat, minus the advantage, divided by the number of farthings in a pound, carried to the third decimal of an ounce. The apprentice's eyes glaze over. The baker sighs and says what every baker learned to say: just make them the weight I show you, and pray the inspectors don't change the tables again. Because that's the thing about the Assize of bread, it wasn't static. You're witnessing a system that required constant adjustment, constant recalculation, constant vigilance. Every time wheat prices changed significantly, the town crier would announce new weights. Sometimes this happened weekly. Imagine running a business where your product specifications changed with the weather, where you couldn't simply raise prices to maintain profit margins, where the only variable you controlled was how much you put into each loaf. The pressure must have been extraordinary. The quirky reality that few people know: some towns had official assize masters whose entire job consisted of knowing the tables, updating them, and testing bakers. These men wielded tremendous power despite being essentially middle management in the medieval bureaucracy. An assize master could make or break your bakery with a single inspection. Some were scrupulously honest. Others, well, you're watching one right now accept a small purse from a nervous baker, and you notice how he doesn't bother weighing that baker's loaves quite as carefully as he did the previous shops. You're holding a loaf yourself now, feeling its weight in your hands, and you're struck by something profound. This bread represents the medieval attempt to mathematically solve human greed and human need simultaneously. The authorities weren't stupid. They knew bakers needed to make a living, that too much regulation would drive people out of the trade, that bread shortages were worse than expensive bread. But they also knew that unregulated markets could lead to starvation and revolution. So they threaded this incredibly narrow needle, trying to balance compassion, commerce, and control. Let me tell you about the bread itself, because the assize regulations affected not just weight and price, but quality. You're tasting a piece of medieval white bread now, and it's nothing like modern Wonder Bread. It's dense, chewy, with a crust so hard you could use it as a weapon. The flour was ground on stone mills that left tiny particles of grit in every loaf, particles that would slowly wear down your teeth over a lifetime. The wealthy paid premium prices for bread where the flour had been sifted multiple times through progressively finer cloths, removing more and more of the impurities. The poor ate bread so dark and heavy it sat in your stomach like a stone, but it kept you alive, and that was what mattered. The Assize recognised these quality differences and priced them accordingly, but here's where enforcement became tricky. You're watching an inspector cut open a loaf, examining the crumb, the internal structure, looking for signs that the baker stretched expensive white flour by mixing in cheaper grain. This was illegal, a form of fraud that could get you pilloried or worse. The inspector has to rely on experience, on the look and feel and even smell of the bread, because there's no chemical test, no lab analysis, just one man's judgment against another man's livelihood. Do you remember when I mentioned that intent barely mattered in medieval law? Nowhere is that more apparent than in assize violations. You're in a courtroom now, well, more like a corner of the guild hall watching a baker plead his case. His scales were accurate, he swears. The flour was good, the oven temperature was right, but somehow his loaves came out underweight, just by a few ounces, just enough to violate the assize. Maybe the humidity was wrong. Maybe he miscalculated the water content. Maybe the dough rose less than expected. None of it matters. The law doesn't care about your intentions or your explanations. The law cares about the weight on the scale. The punishment system had tiers, and you're learning them now by watching the magistrate pronounce sentence. First offence, a heavy fine, enough to hurt but not enough to destroy. Second offence, the pillory for a day, standing locked in that wooden frame while the town uses you for target practice with whatever rotten produce they can find. Third offence. The magistrate's face grows stern, and you hear the words that make the baker go pale: forfeiture of goods and expulsion from the guild. Without guild membership, you can't legally bake. Without baking, you have no trade. You become nothing, a vagrant, which brings its own set of laws and punishments that we'll explore later. What's remarkable is how this system spread across England and then throughout Europe with variations. You're travelling now, watching similar scenes play out in Paris, in Bruges, in Florence. Each city, each kingdom developed its own version of the assize, its own tables, its own enforcement mechanisms. The French were particularly strict, if records are to be believed, the Germans sometimes more lenient. But everywhere, the principle remained the same: bread was too important to leave to chance or to individual honesty. You're watching the sun rise over a market square in Norwich, but this morning's light reveals something that makes you stop cold. A man stands locked in the pillory, his head and hands thrust through holes in a wooden frame, and around his neck hangs a loaf of bread on a rope. The bread is clearly underweight, you can see it's too small even from a distance, and it's been marked with black paint so everyone knows exactly what crime this baker committed. His name is Thomas Chestershire, and according to the court records that still exist from 1316, this is his second offence. The first cost him 2 shillings. This one costs him his dignity and possibly much more. The pillory wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially lethal. You're close enough now to see that someone has already thrown a rock that opened a gash above Thomas's eye. Blood trickles down his cheek, mixing with the rotten egg yolk someone else hurled at him an hour ago. He can't wipe his face. He can't protect himself. He can't even shift his weight much because the frame is built to hold him in an awkward, straining position. He'll stand here for 6 hours, and if the crowd turns really ugly, if someone remembers they paid good money for his short-weighted bread, while their children went hungry, those rocks could get bigger, could hit harder. People have died in the pillory, either from direct violence or from exposure, and the authorities considered this an acceptable risk, part of the punishment. But the pillory is just the beginning of the escalation ladder for bread crimes. You're watching a different scene now, in a different town, where a female baker named Agnes has been convicted of selling ale and bread both underweight. The punishment for women sometimes differed from men, and what you're witnessing is something called the cucking stool or ducking stool. Agnes sits strapped into a chair at the end of a long wooden beam that pivots over the river. The operator pulls a lever, and the beam swings out, plunging Agnes into the freezing water. She comes up gasping, sputtering, and you can hear her screaming apologies, promising never to cheat again. But the operator dunks her twice more before the magistrate signals that justice has been satisfied. Here's the quirky detail most historians love: the ducking stool was specifically gendered punishment. used primarily for women who committed scold's crimes offences related to household commerce like brewing and baking. Men got the pillory, women got the duck. Both were public humiliation rituals designed to shame the offender so thoroughly that they'd never risk repeating the offence. But historians still argue whether the ducking stool was actually more merciful than the pillory, since at least the victim wasn't standing exposed for hours. The water was cold and the experience terrifying, but it was relatively quick. Of course, if you couldn't swim and the operator held you under too long, well, that was another story entirely. You're in the records room now, running your fingers over parchment that lists bread offences and their punishments across decades. What becomes clear is that the system operated on a 3 strikes principle that would seem familiar to modern justice systems, except the medieval version was far less forgiving. First offence fine, second offence corporal punishment and public humiliation. Third offence things got very dark very quickly. You're reading about a baker in London named John Brid who was convicted in 1327 of his third bread offence. The sentence doesn't say execution directly, but it says he was expelled from the city forever on pain of death should he return. Exile was often a death sentence by another name, especially in winter, especially if you had no trade and no guild protection in whatever foreign town you washed up in. But some places were even more direct. You're in France now, in a town square where a repeat offender named Pierre isn't being exiled, he's being led to a scaffold, his crime mixing sawdust into his flour to stretch it during a famine year, selling those loaves at full price, then being caught doing it again after his first punishment. The crowd is enormous, and you realise this execution isn't just about Pierre. It's about sending a message to every baker in the region: tamper with bread during a famine and we will kill you. The authorities needed bread makers. Yes, but they needed people to trust the bread supply even more. One corrupt baker executed might save 100 lives by preventing riots or by deterring other bakers from similar fraud. The execution methods varied wildly depending on region and century. You're not watching Pierre hang. You're watching him locked in an iron cage that's being lowered into the river, slowly, giving him time to contemplate his fate as the water rises. It's theatrical and horrible, and the crowd watches in almost complete silence. Some executions were quicker, a simple hanging, over in minutes. Others were deliberately prolonged, like this drowning cage, meant to maximise both the suffering and the spectacle. The medieval mind didn't see this as cruel, they saw it as proportional. Pierre took people's money while giving them bread mixed with wood shavings. He essentially poisoned them slowly while stealing from them. The punishment needed to reflect not just the technical crime, but the moral weight of betraying the basic social contract. Do you remember the baker Thomas from the pillory? You're checking on him now as the sun begins to set and he's finally being released. He can barely stand. His legs won't hold him, and he collapses onto the cobblestones, weeping. Someone from his family, his wife, maybe, or his sister helps him stumble home. He's alive. But you wonder if he'll ever bake again, if his reputation can survive this, if his neighbours will buy from a man they watched pelted with garbage for 6 hours. The punishment extends beyond the physical suffering. It destroys your social standing, your trustworthiness, your very identity as a craftsman. The guild records tell you something interesting. Many bakers who received second offence punishment simply disappeared from the rolls. They didn't get convicted a third time because they quit the trade, moved away, or died. The system was designed to remove bad actors permanently one way or another. If the pillory didn't convince you to bake honest bread, if the ducking didn't terrify you into compliance, then the third strike would remove you from the profession through exile, execution, or your own decision to flee before the third conviction came down. You're in a tavern now, listening to bakers talk in low voices about someone named Richard, who recently received his second conviction in a neighbouring town. They're debating whether he'll try to cheat the scales again or whether he'll go straight, as they put it. One older baker says something chilling, better he hang than bring down more inspections on all of us. There's a collective interest in maintaining standards. You realise. Because one baker's crimes could trigger crackdowns that hurt everyone. The guild policed itself not just out of moral conviction, but out of pure survival instinct. Let me tell you about the appeals process, which is to say, there wasn't really one. You're watching a baker try to argue that the inspector's scales were faulty, that he should be allowed to reweigh his loaves on different equipment. The magistrate's response is swift and final. The official scales are the official scales, blessed by the guild, certified by the Crown's representative, and beyond question, your scales at home might be perfectly accurate, but they don't matter. Only the public scales determine guilt or innocence, and once they've rendered their verdict, quite literally their weight judgment, the case is closed. You're stepping into a medieval alehouse. And the first thing that hits you isn't the smell of beer, it's the smell of bread, because the two were inseparable in medieval commerce. The woman stirring a massive pot of fermenting grain is called an alewife, and she's part of a tradition that stretches back centuries. Her name might be Matilda or Emma or Joan, and in many towns she outnumbers male brewers 10-1. Brewing was women's work, kitchen work, an extension of the domestic sphere that somehow also became a regulated, dangerous, potentially lethal profession. You're watching her taste the ale from a wooden ladle, and you can see the worry in her eyes because tomorrow the ale conners are coming, the official inspectors who will test her brew and determine whether she's kept her end of the social contract. The assize of ale worked almost identically to the assize of bread. With one crucial difference, ale spoiled much faster than bread. You couldn't make a week's worth and store it. You brewed in small batches, sold it within days, and the quality could vary wildly based on factors the alewife couldn't always control: temperature, the quality of the grain, the cleanliness of her vessels, even the phase of the moon according to some medieval beliefs. Yet the law expected consistency, expected honesty, expected that every measure of ale she sold would be good and wholesome, according to standards that remained frustratingly vague until someone decided they weren't met. Here's where the story gets fascinating, and dark ale conners the inspectors had a traditional method for testing ale strength. You're watching two of them arrive at Matilda's alehouse right now, and they're doing something that seems absurd until you understand the logic. They're pouring ale onto a wooden bench, then sitting in it, wearing their leather breeches. They'll sit there for a specific period, some sources say half an hour, drinking and talking, while the ale soaks into the wood beneath them. When they stand up, if their breeches stick to the bench, the ale is good, it contains enough sugar and alcohol to be sticky. If they stand up easily, if there's no adhesion, the ale is weak, which means watered down, which means fraud, the quirky truth. This test is basically nonsense from a scientific standpoint, but it persisted for centuries because it was dramatic, public, and hard to fake. You're watching Matilda's face as the ale conners stand, and there's a horrible moment of tension before one of them nods approvingly. She's safe today. But you've heard stories about alewives who weren't so lucky, who watched those inspectors stand smoothly, who heard the words weak ale pronounced like a death sentence. The punishment for selling weak ale mirrored bread punishments in escalation and creativity. First offence might cost an alewife 3 shillings and 4pence, a substantial sum, perhaps a week's profit. Second offence brought public humiliation, often the ducking stool you witnessed earlier, but third offence. You're reading court records from 1364 about an alewife named Catherine Webster, who was convicted of repeatedly selling unwholesome ale during a time of grain shortage. The records don't specify execution, but they note she was put out of town with all her household, forbidden to return on pain of imprisonment without term. In medieval speak, that meant prison until death if she came back. But some alewives faced even worse. You're in a different town now, watching a woman named Sybil standing in the pillory with a special addition to the usual setup. They forced a funnel into her mouth and are pouring her own weak ale down her throat while the crowd jeers. It's called drinking her own medicine, and it's simultaneously punishment and public demonstration of exactly what she tried to sell to honest people. The ale is probably sour, possibly contaminated, and they're making her consume far more than any person would willingly drink. You can see her choking, gagging, and you have to look away. Do you remember how I said women-dominated brewing that created an interesting dynamic with the male-dominated legal system? You're noticing that female bakers and brewers often receive different punishments than men, sometimes more theatrical, sometimes more focused on public humiliation rather than physical pain. Historians still argue whether this represented a kind of mercy or whether it reflected deeper misogyny, a sense that women's crimes were offences against natural feminine virtue and therefore required shaming rather than straightforward violence. The ducking stool, the forced drinking, the public display, these were designed to humiliate in specifically gendered ways. You're following an alewife named Joanna through her day, and you're struck by how the regulatory burden shaped every decision she made. She had to purchase grain from licensed sellers. She had to brew in vessels that could be inspected at any time. She had to sell at prices fixed by the Assize tables. She had to display a special ale staker pole or sign outside her door whenever she had fresh ale, so inspectors would know to test it. She couldn't brew secretly, couldn't sell from the back door, couldn't operate outside the system even for a day. The surveillance was total, and the penalties for trying to evade it were severe. Let me tell you about the intersection of ale crimes and bread crimes, because many women did both. You're watching a woman named Agnes Forrester who baked bread in the morning and brewed ale in the afternoon, trying to make enough money to support 3 children after her husband died in a farming accident. She's been convicted twice before, once for underweight bread, once for weak ale, and now she's been caught again, this time with both violations simultaneously. The magistrate seems almost sad as he pronounces sentence 40 lashes and expulsion from the guild. Without guild protection, Agnes can't legally bake or brew. She's 45 years old with no other trade. You're watching her future dissolve in real time. The cruelty of the system becomes most apparent in famine years or times of grain shortage. You're in 1315 now, during the Great Famine that would kill millions across Europe. Grain prices have skyrocketed, and alewives and bakers face an impossible choice: buy expensive grain and sell at fixed prices, losing money on every transaction, or water down your ale and shortweight your bread to survive. Many chose survival. The court records from famine years explode with bread and ale violations, and the punishments become increasingly harsh because the authorities were terrified of riots, of social breakdown, of the thin line between order and chaos finally snapping. You're in a courtroom watching a mass trial, 15 alewives and 6 bakers all convicted of assize violations during the famine. The magistrate is clearly overwhelmed. He can't execute them all. He can't even imprison them all because the jail isn't big enough and feeding prisoners during a famine is itself problematic. So he improvises massive fines that bankrupt most of them. Public whippings for 5, exile for 3, and a stern warning that the next violation will mean death regardless of circumstances. The message is clear: we know you're starving too, but you cannot cheat the people. Someone has to maintain standards even when the world is ending. What's remarkable is how some alewives and bakers became repeat offenders despite knowing the escalating punishments. You're reading about a woman named Marjorie who was convicted 6 times over a decade for various ale violations. 6 times after the third, she should have been exiled or worse. But somehow she kept brewing, kept getting caught, kept paying fines or standing in the pillory. The records suggest she was either incredibly brave, incredibly desperate, or perhaps had some kind of protection, a lover who was a guild official. Maybe. Or family connections that kept the ultimate punishment at bay. The system had cracks, and some people learned to survive in these narrow spaces between the rules. You're walking through a forest that doesn't belong to you, and that fact alone could get you killed. The trees around you aren't just trees, they're the property of the king or some noble lord, and every deer, every rabbit, every pheasant rustling in the underbrush is protected by laws so draconian they make the bread regulations look almost merciful. You're watching a peasant family huddled in their cottage at the forest edge, and the father is explaining to his son why they can't trap the rabbits that are eating their vegetable garden. Those rabbits belong to the Lord, he says, and his voice carries a weight of fear that seems disproportionate until you understand what happened to his neighbour last month. The forest laws of medieval England were perhaps the most hated legislation ever imposed on common people. William the Conqueror created vast royal forests, not necessarily dense woodland, but any area declared under forest law where hunting was restricted to nobility. You're looking at a map from 1250 and you're shocked to see that nearly a third of England falls under these restrictions. Entire villages existed within royal forests, and the people living there faced an impossible situation. Game animals surrounded them, often destroying their crops. But touching those animals meant risking mutilation or death. Here's the connection to bread crimes that people miss. Both were subsistence offences. You're watching a family that hasn't eaten meat in 3 months because they can't afford to buy it legally and they're too terrified to poach it. Their children are developing the telltale signs of malnutrition, distended bellies, thinning hair, listless movements. A rabbit could feed them for 2 days. A deer could keep them alive through winter, but taking that rabbit carries the same penalty as stealing from the king's treasury. In some periods, poaching deer was considered high treason, and you know what the penalty for treason is. You're in the forest at night now, watching a man named Thomas Atwood, the court records from 1310 preserve his name, setting a snare for rabbits. His hands shake as he conceals the twisted wire among the brambles. He's not a career criminal. He's a farmer whose crops failed, whose wife is pregnant, whose older children are already weak from hunger. The rabbit represents survival, but it also represents a gamble with his life. And you can see he knows this because he keeps glancing over his shoulder, starting at every sound. The enforcement of forest law fell to special officers called foresters or verderers, and these men wielded terrifying power. You're watching a group of them on patrol right now, and they're not looking for evidence of poaching, they're looking for poachers themselves. If they catch you red-handed with game, the punishment is immediate and brutal. In the early Norman period, poachers could be blinded or castrated. By the 13th century, those mutilations were technically illegal, but that just meant they hanged you instead. Some might argue hanging is more merciful than blinding, but try telling that to the families who watched their fathers or brothers dangle from gallows trees at the forest edge. Do you remember how bread crimes operated on a 3-strike system? Forest law sometimes didn't bother with strikes. You're reading the Assize of the Forest from 1184, and the language is chillingly absolute. Anyone caught taking the king's venison that's deer is to be dealt with as a robber of the king's forest. No first offence mercy, no escalating punishment, just immediate classification as a serious criminal. Some scholars argue this reflected the symbolic importance of deer as royal animals, almost sacred representatives of the king's power. Others suggest it was simply about protecting a valuable food source for nobility. Either way, a starving peasant and a wealthy noble's trophy animal were weighed on vastly unequal scales. The quirky detail that makes this even more surreal: you could be punished not just for taking game, but for disturbing it. You're watching foresters arrest a young man whose crime was walking his dog through the forest and accidentally causing deer to flee. No animals were harmed. No hunting took place. But the disruption of the king's game was itself illegal. He's looking at a fine he can't possibly pay, which means prison, which means his family loses their primary worker, which means they might starve anyway. The law creates a kind of doom loop where poverty leads to crime leads to punishment leads to greater poverty. You're in a forest court now. These were special judicial sessions held specifically for forest offences, and the proceedings have a quality that differs from regular courts. The foresters testify with absolute authority. The accused rarely have witnesses because potential witnesses risk being charged as accomplices. The punishments handed down are swift and harsh. You're watching a man convicted of taking a single deer being sentenced to hang within 3 days. His wife is screaming, his children clinging to him, and the judge remains utterly unmoved. The law is the law, and the forest is the king's, and that's the end of it. Let me tell you about the parallel between bread and game, because it reveals something profound about medieval justice. Both were necessities, bread for everyone, meat for nobility. Both were tightly controlled because they represented more than food. They represented social order itself. If peasants could hunt freely, if bakers could charge freely, the entire hierarchical structure of medieval society might collapse. The bread laws kept urban populations from rioting. The forest laws kept rural populations from thinking they had rights to the natural abundance around them. You're seeing social control disguised as resource management, and the violence wasn't incidental, it was the point. You're back with Thomas now, checking his snare at dawn, and there's a rabbit in it. For one moment, his face shows pure relief food. Finally, blessed food. Then you see him go rigid as he hears voices. The foresters. They're still 50 yards away, but they're coming this direction, and Thomas has perhaps 10 seconds to decide: run and abandon the rabbit and the snare evidence of his crime, or try to grab them and flee, or stand his ground and face whatever comes. You watch him choose the worst option. He freezes, paralysed by fear and hunger and desperation, and the foresters are upon him before he can move. What happens next is an execution. Not immediately, but it might be worse. The foresters confiscate the rabbit and destroy the snare. They arrest Thomas and drag him not to a regular jail, but to a forest prison. A horrible place where poachers are kept in conditions that amount to slow execution. The records from these prisons are sparse, but what exists suggests mortality rates approached 50%. People died from disease, from beatings, from simple neglect. Thomas's trial won't come for months, and he might not survive to see it. Historians still argue whether forest law was actually enforced as brutally as the written statutes suggest, or whether many violations went unpunished simply because the forests were too vast to patrol effectively. You're seeing evidence for both positions Thomas caught and imprisoned, while in the next valley over, a group of villagers runs what amounts to a regular poaching operation, carefully targeting areas where foresters rarely venture, taking small game in numbers that might go unnoticed. The system was porous, but the porousness itself created another kind of terror. You never knew if you'd be the unlucky one caught. The example made? You're sitting at a banquet table that would make modern food photographers weep with joy. but you're not allowed to eat anything on it. Not because you're not hungry, you're starving. Actually, but because the food in front of you is illegal for someone of your social class. That roasted swan with its feathers carefully reattached to look lifelike. Forbidden? The pastries made with white flour and sugar. Not for you. Even the cut of that beef matters. Certain parts of the animal were reserved for nobility, and a commoner caught eating the wrong piece could face serious consequences. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, where what you ate, wore and owned was strictly regulated based on your position in the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. The word sumptuary comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expense, and these laws tried to control consumption in ways that seem almost absurd to modern minds. You're reading a statute from 1363 England that specifies exactly what each social class can eat. Knights and their families could have 2 courses of meat or fish at dinner. Merchants and wealthy citizens could have 3 courses, but not certain dishes. Peasants and labourers were restricted to bread, ale, and whatever cheap protein they could afford. The law didn't just recommend these restrictions, it enforced them with fines, imprisonment, and public humiliation. Here's where bread enters the picture in a way you might not expect. The type of bread you could legally eat depended on your social status. You're in a bakery watching a customer request the whitest, finest bread available manchet. It's called made from flour that's been sifted multiple times through cloth so fine it removed virtually all the bran and wheat germ. The baker looks at the customer's clothing, assessing their rank, and you can see the calculation happening behind his eyes. If this person is below a certain station and someone reports the baker for selling them luxury bread, both parties could be prosecuted. The baker might lose his license. The customer might be whipped for presumption. The rationale behind sumptuary laws sounds almost reasonable when the authorities explain it. Everyone trying to eat above their station or dress beyond their means creates economic chaos. You're listening to a nobleman justify these laws at court, and his argument goes something like this: if merchants can eat like lords, they'll spend money on luxuries instead of investing in trade. If peasants can eat fine bread, they'll become dissatisfied with their natural position. The social order depends on visual and culinary markers that instantly communicate status. Remove those markers, and civilization itself collapses into confusion and disorder. But you're watching what actually happens, and it looks less like social preservation and more like naked class warfare. A merchant's wife has been dragged before a magistrate because someone reported her serving peacock at a private dinner party. Peacock was a display food, reserved for the highest nobility, and this woman, whose husband is wealthy but not noble, has committed the crime of culinary presumption. The penalty: a fine of 40 shillings, which is substantial but not devastating. What's devastating is the public reading of her offence. The announcement to the entire town that she tried to eat above her station. The shame is the real punishment. Do you remember the upper crust phrase I mentioned way back at the beginning? You're seeing where it comes from right now. You're in a noble household watching servants prepare a massive loaf of bread for the high table. The loaf is enormous, perhaps 2 feet across, and when it's sliced, the upper crust, the top portion, goes to the lord and lady. The middle goes to lesser nobles and important guests. The bottom, which has often soaked up grease and liquid from the table bread, sometimes served as an edible plate called a trencher, goes to servants and, if they're lucky, to beggars at the gate. Taking the upper crust when you are not entitled to it wasn't just rude, it could be prosecuted as theft of goods belonging to your social betters. The quirky enforcement of bread-related sumptuary laws created a bizarre surveillance culture. You're watching neighbours spy on neighbours, noting who buys what at the market, reporting suspicious purchases to local officials, A woman buying white flour when her husband is just a labourer. Reported. A family having guests and cooking foods beyond their station. Reported. The system ran on mutual suspicion, everyone policing everyone else, because there were sometimes rewards for informants a share of the fine, or simply the satisfaction of cutting down someone who got too ambitious. Let me tell you about the intersection of sumptuary laws and famine, because it reveals the naked hypocrisy of the system. You're in 1315 again, during the Great Famine, and people are literally dying in the streets. But the sumptuary laws remain in force. A peasant who somehow scrapes together enough money to buy white bread, which might be the only bread available at certain times, can technically be prosecuted for eating above his station, even as he's starving. The authorities sometimes suspended these laws during extreme crises, but sometimes they didn't, and the records contain accounts of people punished for eating illegal food while surrounded by famine. You're in France now, where sumptuary laws took different but equally rigid forms. The French authorities obsessed over banquet displays, the number of courses, the types of meats served at feasts. A merchant throwing a wedding for his daughter had to carefully count courses and avoid certain dishes, or risk massive fines and social disgrace. You're watching such a wedding right now, and the host is clearly wealthy enough to afford an extravagant feast. But he's serving a deliberately modest meal because the law demands it. His guests understand the game, they're eating simple roasted chicken and dark bread not because the host is cheap, but because he's following the law, and they all pretend this is perfectly normal. Historians still argue whether sumptuary laws were effectively enforced, or were mostly symbolic gestures that people ignored. You're seeing evidence for both sides. Some records show regular prosecutions, fines collected, people shamed for violations. Other records suggest widespread evasion, with wealthy merchants eating whatever they pleased behind closed doors and no one caring enough to report it. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. The laws were enforced enough to create constant anxiety, to remind everyone of their place, but porous enough that the truly wealthy and connected could usually buy or bribe their way out of consequences. You're watching a baker have a crisis of conscience right now. A wealthy merchant servant is requesting 20 loaves of the finest manchet bread, clearly for a banquet that's going to violate sumptuary laws. The baker knows this. The merchant knows the baker knows. The servant is offering double the usual price. If the baker refuses, he loses a substantial sale and might anger a powerful patron. If he accepts and someone reports it, he could lose his baking license. He accepts, because merchants have power that peasants don't, and power creates its own loopholes in even the strictest laws. You're standing outside the heavy wooden doors of a guild hall, and you can hear shouting from inside angry voices, fists pounding on tables, the unmistakable sound of men whose livelihoods are being threatened. This is the Worshipful Company of Bakers, one of the most powerful guilds in London, and they've just learned that someone has been baking bread without their permission. Not just baking casually for family, but selling loaves at market, undercutting guild prices, operating entirely outside the system that the guild members spent years and fortunes joining. The interloper's name is William Carpenter Ironic, since his actual trade is woodworking and the guild is about to make an example of him that will echo through the city for months. Guild monopolies weren't just about quality control or maintaining standards, though that's how they justified themselves. You're reading the guild charter now, and beneath the flowery language about upholding the ancient and honourable craft of baking and ensuring wholesome bread for the citizenry, you can see the real purpose controlling who could bake, how much they could charge, and most importantly, eliminating all competition. The guild was a cartel, and like all cartels, it maintained power through a combination of legitimate authority and absolutely ruthless enforcement against anyone who threatened the monopoly. To become a guild baker, you're watching a boy named Thomas begin what will be a 7-year apprenticeship. He's 12 years old, and his father has just paid a substantial fee, £3, which is more than a labourer earns in a year for the privilege of having Thomas learn the trade. For the next 7 years, Thomas will work without wages, sleeping in the bakery, working from before dawn until after dark, learning every secret of the craft while essentially serving as cheap labour for his master. At the end, if he survives and his master certifies him as competent, he'll become a journeyman allowed to work for wages but still not permitted to open his own bakery. Here's the shocking part: after completing your apprenticeship and working as a journeyman for several more years, you still couldn't just open a bakery. You're watching a journeyman named Robert apply for master status, and the requirements are staggering. He has to produce a masterpiece, an exceptional loaf or series of loaves that demonstrate absolute mastery of the craft. He has to pay another substantial fee to the guild. He has to prove he has enough capital to set up a proper bakery with all required equipment. He has to swear oaths of loyalty to the guild and the crown. And even then, the guild might reject him if they decide there are already enough bakers in the area, because the last thing they wanted was too much competition driving down everyone's profits. Now you're watching what happens to William Carpenter, the unlicensed baker. The guild has filed a complaint with the city authorities, and a group of guild officials accompanied by a bailiff are raiding William's makeshift bakery. They're not just arresting him, they're destroying his oven, smashing his bowls and tools, confiscating his flour. William is shouting that he's doing nothing wrong, that people need bread and he's just trying to feed his family by providing it. The guildmaster responds with words you'll never forget. "You have no right to this trade. The right belongs to us, granted by the crown, and we will defend it unto death." The penalty for unlicensed baking varied by location and era, but it was always severe. You're reading court records from 1340 where William's case is heard. He's fined £10, a crushing sum he has no hope of paying, and sentenced to prison until the debt is satisfied. That's basically a life sentence, because you can't earn money in prison to pay off fines. His family will be destitute. His children will likely end up begging or apprenticed out to whoever will take them for free, all because he tried to bake bread without guild permission. But guild enforcement wasn't just about prosecuting outsiders, it was about controlling members too. You're in a guild meeting now, listening to charges being brought against a member baker named John, who's been accused of selling bread privately to wealthy households at prices below the guild agreed rates. His fellow guild members are angrier at him than they were at William the Outsider, because John betrayed the Brotherhood, broke the price-fixing agreement that kept everyone profitable. The punishment isn't exile guilds rarely expelled members because membership was too valuable, but John is fined heavily and publicly censured. More importantly, the guild decides to inspect his bakery weekly for the next year, watching for any other violations, making his life miserable until he falls back in line. Do you remember how I mentioned that guilds controlled not just who could bake, but where they could bake? You're discovering that some guilds divided cities into territories, assigning each master baker a specific area where they had monopoly rights. Opening a bakery outside your assigned zone, even if you were a guild member in good standing, could trigger guild sanctions. You're watching two bakers nearly come to blows over territorial violations. One claims the other is selling at a market that falls in his protected zone. The guild has to intervene, examine old maps and charters, and eventually rules in favour of the older baker, forcing the younger one to withdraw from that market entirely. The quirky detail that reveals how powerful guilds became some achieved the right to run their own courts for trade-related offences. You're in a guild court now, and it's almost identical to a royal court except all the officials are bakers. They hear cases about underweight bread, about quality violations, about territorial disputes, and they hand down sentences that include fines, corporal punishment, and expulsion. The Crown granted these rights because it was convenient to let the bakers police themselves, and the royal courts have fewer cases to handle. But it created mini-kingdoms within kingdoms, trade organisations that wielded judicial power over their members' lives. Let me tell you about the bread wars between guilds, because sometimes guild monopolies collided with other guild monopolies in spectacular fashion. You're watching a legal battle between the Bakers' Guild and the Cooks' Guild over who has the right to make certain types of pastries. The bakers claim anything made with flour and baked falls under their jurisdiction. The cooks claim anything served as part of a prepared meal falls under theirs. Both guilds have crown charters supporting their positions. The lawsuit drags on for years, costing both guilds fortunes in legal fees. And you realise this is about more than pastries, it's about power, about market share, about which organisation controls a profitable segment of food production. Historians still argue whether guild monopolies helped or hurt medieval economies. You're seeing both sides of the argument play out in real time. On one hand, the guild system ensured quality standards, prevented price gouging during normal times, and created a structure for training new bakers. On the other hand, it stifled innovation, kept prices artificially high, excluded talented bakers who couldn't afford entry fees, and created an insider class that protected itself at everyone else's expense. A peasant who might have been an excellent baker never got the chance if he couldn't afford the apprenticeship fee, and the city's bread supply was poorer for it. You're back at the guild hall, watching the aftermath of William Carpenter's prosecution. The guild members are celebrating their victory, toasting to the preservation of their monopoly, already planning the next raid on another unlicensed baker someone reported operating in the suburbs. One older baker stands and makes a speech about tradition, about honour, about the sacred trust of the baking craft. His words are beautiful and ring with genuine conviction. But you're watching a young apprentice in the corner whose face shows something different: fear. Maybe, or realization that he has entered a system that will control his entire life, that will determine where he works and what he charges and who he can teach. And the price of stepping outside those boundaries is complete destruction. You're waking up on a Friday morning in Lent, and the anxiety in the household is palpable even before you've fully opened your eyes. Today is a fast day, which means the rules about what you can eat aren't just social customs or legal regulations. They're divine commandments, enforced by both church and state, with a zeal that makes the bread inspectors look relaxed. You're watching a mother explain to her children that today they'll eat no meat, no eggs, no dairy. And if anyone asks, they absolutely did not have butter on their morning bread. The children look confused, the mother looks terrified, and you're beginning to understand that in medieval Europe, the wrong type of bread on the wrong day could literally get you burned at the stake. The church's fasting regulations were extraordinarily complex, and they changed throughout the year in ways that required constant attention. You're looking at a religious calendar, and nearly half the days are marked as fast days or partial fast days. Every Friday commemorated Christ's crucifixion, no meat. The entire 40 days of Lent before Easter, no meat. No dairy, no eggs, Ember days, Rogation days, the vigils of major saints' feasts all restricted. For medieval people who lived in a world without refrigeration or global food supply chains, these restrictions weren't inconvenient, they were potentially life-threatening, especially for the poor who could barely afford sufficient food even without restrictions. Here's where bread becomes a minefield. Different types of bread were considered appropriate or inappropriate for fast days. You're in a bakery watching a customer request bread made with milk and eggs, what we might call an enriched dough. The baker looks at the calendar, sees it's Lent, and flatly refuses. Making or selling such bread during a fasting period could get both baker and customer charged with sacrilege. Instead, the baker offers plain bread made only with flour, water, salt, and maybe a tiny bit of oil if you're lucky. It's dense, it's bland, and it's legally and spiritually safe. But the enforcement wasn't just about types of bread, it was about who was eating what and when. You're watching a scene that's both absurd and terrifying. Church wardens going door to door during Lent, inspecting kitchens, looking for evidence of forbidden foods. They're trained to spot the signs, the smell of meat cooking, butter residue in a pan, eggshells in the refuse pile. You're in a cottage right now where they've just found a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth and hidden in a cupboard. The householder, a widow named Margaret, is trying to explain that the cheese is old, left from before Lent started, that she was saving it for after Easter. The wardens aren't interested in excuses. The punishment for breaking fast could range from public penance to excommunication to charges of heresy. And heresy could mean death. You're reading the case of a man named Walter Winter, who was charged in 1431 with eating meat on a Friday. His first offence brought a requirement to do public penance standing outside the church for 3 Sundays, confessing his sin to everyone who entered. His second offence, a year later, was treated more seriously. The church court questioned whether his repeated violations indicated heretical beliefs, whether he denied the authority of the church to regulate diet. Walter protested that he was simply hungry, that he'd killed a hen that was going to die anyway and didn't want to waste it. The court didn't care about his reasoning, they cared about his obedience. Do you remember the intersection of bread crimes and desperation we've seen throughout this story? You're seeing it again now, but with an added theological dimension. A family's starving during Lent. They have eggs from their chicken's protein, nutrition, the difference between their children living or dying. But eggs are forbidden during this season. Eating them means risking not just earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. Or so the church teaches. You're watching the father weigh his options, obey the law, and watch his children waste away. Or break it and risk everything. He breaks it. He feeds his family. And a neighbour who notices the eggshells in their refuse pile reports them. The quirky and horrifying detail, some regions had dispensations that allowed certain foods during fasts if you paid for the privilege. You're in a bishop's office watching wealthy merchants purchase letters of indulgence that permitted them to eat butter, eggs, or milk during Lent. The fee was substantial, but for the rich, it was just another cost of doing business. Meanwhile, poor families who couldn't afford the dispensation had to follow the letter of the law or risk prosecution. The system was explicitly class-based. The wealthy could buy their way out of religious obligations, while the poor suffered both physical and spiritual anxiety over every morsel. You're in a marketplace on a Friday, and you're noticing something strange. Some bakers have 2 completely separate displays. One side shows plain, fast-day appropriate breads, the other shows enriched breads clearly made with forbidden ingredients. You approach the baker and quietly ask who's allowed to buy from the second display. He gives you a knowing look and says, "Those with letters from the bishop, or those who don't care about their souls." It's said lightly, but there's judgment in his voice, and you realise he's watching every customer, noting who buys what, possibly reporting violations to church authorities either out of genuine piety or because there's a finder's fee for reporting heretics. Let me tell you about the conflation of dietary law and heresy, because this is where things become truly dark. You're reading about the Cathars, a heretical sect that rejected many Catholic teachings and, relevant to our story, had different rules about fasting. In the 13th century, the church launched crusades against the Cathars, and one way to identify suspected heretics was to watch what they ate and when. If you refuse to eat meat even on non-fast days, as some Cathars did, you might be investigated. If you ate meat on fast days, same thing. The simple act of consuming bread made with eggs on the wrong day could trigger an inquisition, and inquisitions regularly ended with burnings. You're witnessing an inquisition trial now, and the accused is a woman named Paranel who's been reported for suspicious eating habits. The inquisitors are asking her detailed questions. What did you eat last Friday? What bread do you buy during Lent? Do you believe the church has authority to regulate diet? Paranel is trying to answer carefully, but every answer seems to trap her further. She admits she sometimes struggles to remember which days are fast days. The inquisitors exchange glances. Is this simple ignorance or deliberate heresy? The distinction matters because one might mean penance and the other might mean fire. Historians still argue about how strictly these food laws were actually enforced among common people versus nobility. You're seeing evidence that enforcement was inconsistent and often politically motivated. A poor person with no protectors might be severely punished for a minor violation, while a noble caught flagrantly breaking fast might receive a gentle reminder from his confessor and nothing more. The law was supposedly universal, but its application was anything but. You're watching this play out as a peasant is sentenced to public whipping for eating lard during Lent, while in the next town over, you hear gossip about a count who hosted an entire feast of forbidden foods and faced no consequences whatsoever. You're back in that anxious household from this morning, and evening has come. The family survived the day, eating their plain bread and thin vegetable soup, and no one reported them for violations because there were none to report. But the mother's relief is palpable, and you realize she faces this anxiety more than 100 days per year, constantly vigilant about food rules that could brand her family as sinners or heretics. Where a simple mistake about the calendar or a moment of weakness could trigger consequences that extend beyond fines or whipping into the realm of eternal souls and burning flesh. You're standing in a field at dawn, watching farmers bring their grain harvest to town, and you notice something peculiar. They're moving slowly, almost reluctantly, and their eyes keep darting to the road ahead where you can see other figures waiting. Those figures aren't fellow farmers or helpful merchants. They're forestallers, a type of criminal so despised in medieval law that their very name became synonymous with treachery. You're about to witness a crime that seems impossible by modern standards, the crime of buying food before it reaches the public market. It sounds absurd until you understand that this practice, called forestalling, could destabilize entire regions and was therefore treated almost like treason. The logic behind anti-forestalling laws made sense in a world without grocery stores, restaurants, or food distribution networks. You're listening to a town crier read a proclamation that explains the rule: all grain, all bread, all foodstuffs must first be offered at the public market where everyone can see the prices and quantities available. No one can intercept goods on the road and buy them privately before the common people get their chance. The market must be fair, transparent and accessible to all. Forestallers who intercepted grain before it reached market could then control supply, artificially inflate prices, and essentially hold the population hostage. In the world where people lived meals away from starvation, this wasn't just unethical, it was a form of violence. You're watching one of those forestallers approach a farmer right now. His name is Thomas Bedtime, and the court records from 1364 preserve not just his name but the details of his crime. He's offering the farmer a price slightly above market rate for the entire cart of wheat right here, right now, cash in hand. The farmer is tempted because immediate payment is attractive, and the price is good. But you can see fear in the farmer's eyes too, because if someone reports this transaction, both men could be prosecuted. Thomas the forestaller risks far worse punishment than the farmer, But the farmer isn't safe either. He's conspiring to deprive the market of goods, and that makes him complicit. The farmer refuses, and Thomas watches him continue toward town with obvious frustration. But you're following Thomas now, and you see him successfully intercept 3 other farmers over the next hour. By the time the market officially opens, Thomas has secured enough wheat to significantly impact available supply. You're watching him arrive at the market later, selling this wheat at prices 30% higher than what he paid. And the crowd's reaction is immediate and ugly. People know what he's done. They can see he has far too much grain for someone who doesn't farm, and they're angry. A woman shouts for staller, and others take up the cry. Here's where the enforcement becomes interesting and violent. Medieval towns didn't always wait for official prosecution of forestallers. You're watching the crowd surge toward Thomas, and what started as angry words is becoming physical. Someone throws a clod of dirt, someone else shoves him. The town bailiff has to physically intervene to prevent what might become a lynching, dragging Thomas away from the mob and into custody for his own protection as much as for justice. The crowd's rage is real and dangerous, born from the understanding that Thomas's greed might mean their children go hungry tonight. The punishment for forestalling varied by region and severity, but it was always harsh. You're in a court watching Thomas's trial, and the magistrate is reading a list of his offences for stalling grain on 7 separate occasions over 2 months, creating artificial scarcity, driving up prices during a time when harvests were already questionable. The sentence comes down: confiscation of all his goods, a massive fine, 6 months in prison, and banishment from the town upon release. Thomas is effectively destroyed financially and socially. His family will suffer for his greed, and that's partly the point. The punishment must be so severe that others think twice before trying the same scheme. But forestalling wasn't just about grain, it applied to bread itself. You're watching a scenario that seems almost comically petty until you understand the stakes. A woman named Alice is accused of buying bread from bakers before they have set up their market stalls, then reselling those loaves at her own stall at a markup. She's a bread forestaller, which might be the most medieval crime you can imagine. Her defence is that she's providing a service consolidating bread from multiple bakers so customers can shop in one place. The prosecution argues she is manipulating supply and extracting profit for doing essentially nothing. The court sides with prosecution. Do you remember how I mentioned that medieval law often didn't care about intent? You're seeing that principle in action as the magistrate explains that Alice's motivations are irrelevant. She bought bread before it reached market. She resold it at higher prices, and therefore she forestalled. Whether she meant to harm the community or thought she was helping doesn't matter. The act itself is criminal. She receives a lighter sentence than Thomas. She's a first offender, and her scale was smaller, but she's still fined heavily and banned from selling any food products for 2 years. The quirky detail that shows how paranoid medieval authorities were about food supply manipulation. Some towns required that all food transactions happen in designated market squares during specific hours. And if you were caught buying or selling food anywhere else or at any other time, you could be prosecuted for forestalling even if you weren't actually trying to manipulate markets. You're watching a man being fined because he bought eggs from a neighbour in his own home at 6 in the evening. The official market hours ended at 5. Therefore, he forestalled. The eggs were for his own family's dinner. He wasn't reselling them, but the law made no exceptions. All food transactions must be public, visible, and within regulated hours. Let me tell you about the intersection of forestalling and bread prices, because this is where the various threads of medieval food law all tangle together. You're watching a complicated scenario unfold. A forestaller buys wheat before it reaches market, driving up grain prices. Bakers must pay these inflated prices, but the Assize bread fixes what they can charge and requires specific loaf weights. The bakers can't pass the full cost to customers without violating the Assize, so they either lose money on every loaf or they cheat the weights. When they cheat the weights, they get caught and punished. The forestaller created a cascade of crime. And while he'll be punished too, the bakers might be ruined first. Historians still argue whether anti-forestalling laws actually helped stabilise food supplies or whether they prevented efficient market operations. You're seeing evidence for both positions. On one hand, the laws forced sellers to bring goods to centralised markets where prices were transparent and competition was fair. On the other hand, the laws prevented legitimate middlemen from operating, forced farmers to waste time travelling to distant markets, and created black markets where food was traded illegally at night. The perfect example of good intentions creating complicated, sometimes counterproductive results. You're back at that dawn scene from the beginning, but this time the farmers make it to market without being intercepted. The market opens, and you're watching the beautiful chaos of medieval commerce, farmers displaying their grain, bakers buying wheat directly from producers, housewives comparing prices and quality, children darting between stalls, the whole community engaged in the transparent, public exchange of food that the law demanded. Is not perfect, there's still haggling, still some price variation, still winners and losers, but everyone can see what's happening, and no one can secretly manipulate supply. For all its harshness, the anti-forestalling law achieved its goal of making food distribution as fair as possible in an unfair world. You're in a warehouse that smells of grain and rats and human desperation, and you're watching a merchant named Richard Lyons count sacks of flour that stretch from wall to wall, stack nearly to the ceiling. There's enough flour here to feed a town for weeks, maybe months. And that's exactly the problem. Outside, people are hungry, bread prices are climbing, bakers are struggling to find supplies, and Richard is sitting on a mountain of grain, waiting for prices to rise even higher before he sells. The crime he's committing has a specific name: engrossing. It means buying up massive quantities of commodity to create artificial scarcity. And in medieval law, doing this with food during times of shortage could get you executed. The distinction between forestalling and engrossing is subtle but important. You're learning that forestalling is about intercepting goods before they reach market, while engrossing is about hoarding them after purchase. Both manipulate supply, both drive up prices, but engrossing is often considered worse because it requires more capital, more planning, and more cold-blooded calculation. A forestaller might be an opportunist grabbing chances as they appear. An engrosser is running what amounts to a criminal enterprise, deliberately creating hunger for profit. You're reading the statute against engrossers from 1266, and the language is fierce. Anyone who buys up corn or other victuals, engross with intent to sell them again, is guilty of a crime against the Commonwealth. The law doesn't prohibit buying large quantities if you intend to use them. A baker can buy plenty of flour for legitimate baking. But buying with intent to resell at inflated prices during shortage, that crosses the line from commerce into something darker. You're seeing the medieval mind grapple with the difference between legitimate trade and predatory hoarding, and they're drawing that line based on intent and timing. Here's where it gets truly dark. Engrossing during famine wasn't just a crime. It was a capital offence in some jurisdictions. You're reading accounts from the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, when millions died across Europe. And engrossers who were caught faced mob violence before they could even reach trial. In one French town, a grain merchant's warehouse was discovered full of hoarded wheat while people literally starved in the streets. The mob broke in, seized the grain, and hanged the merchant from his own warehouse beam. The authorities didn't prosecute the mob. They ruled the killing justifiable, a form of communal self-defense. You're with Richard Lyons now, listening to him justify his actions to himself. He's not a monster in his own mind. He's a businessman making rational decisions. He bought flour when it was cheap. He's storing it properly so it doesn't spoil. And he's simply waiting for market conditions to improve before selling. He'd argue he's providing a valuable service by storing grain through lean times. But you're also noticing that he's calculating exactly how long he can wait before people become desperate enough to pay triple the normal price. And that calculation has nothing to do with service. It's pure predation disguised as commerce. The enforcement against engrossers required detective work because hoarding happened in private. You're watching officials conduct a surprise inspection of Richard's warehouse. And they're not just counting sacks, they're checking dates, examining documents, trying to determine when he bought this flour and whether he's been actively selling it or deliberately withholding it from market. One official notices that Richard purchased most of this flour 3 months ago, during harvest season when prices were low, and has sold almost none of it even as prices doubled. That pattern tells a story. And it's not a story Richard can explain away. Do you remember the concept of intent I keep mentioning? You're seeing it applied in interesting ways here. If Richard can prove he was storing flour to protect against price volatility, to ensure stable supplies for his regular customers, or for some other legitimate business reason, he might avoid the harshest penalties. But if the officials determine he deliberately created scarcity for profit, especially during a time when people were suffering, he faces the full weight of medieval justice. Intent is hard to prove, but sometimes the circumstances speak for themselves. The quirky detail that reveals how seriously authorities took engrossing some towns required merchants to register their inventory levels and report any large purchases of food staples. You're looking at ledgers where merchants had to document exactly how much grain they bought, when they bought it, and how much they sold each week. Officials could audit these records and compare them to market conditions. If you bought heavily during harvest and sold very little while prices rose, you'd be investigated for engrossing. It was medieval-era supply chain surveillance, crude but sometimes effective. Let me tell you about the punishment Richard actually received, because his case from 1376 is historically documented. The officials determined he'd been engrossing not just flour, but also wine, fish, and other staples. His hoarding was systematic and deliberate. The sentence was extraordinary forfeiture of all his goods, everything. Not just the hoarded supplies, plus imprisonment without specified term. Richard died in prison 2 years later, never having been released. His family was left destitute. The message was clear: if you profit from others' hunger, the state will destroy you utterly. But not all engrossers faced such dramatic punishment. You're watching a smaller scale case where a baker named John is accused of hoarding flour in his own bakery, beyond what he could reasonably use for normal production. The evidence suggests he was waiting for prices to rise before baking and selling. But John has guild connections, character witnesses, and a lawyer who argues the flour was for legitimate business expansion. The court finds him guilty but sentences him only to a fine and a warning. You're seeing how wealth, connections, and social position could soften the application of even the harshest laws. Historians still argue whether anti-engrossing laws actually helped prevent famine, or whether they discouraged legitimate grain storage that might have stabilized supplies across seasons. You're watching this debate play out in real time, as one official argues that Richard's flour was at least preserved and could now be distributed, while another counters that if Richard had sold it months ago, bakers could have made bread when people needed it most. Both have valid points. The medieval economy struggled to balance individual profit, motive with collective survival needs, and they never fully solved that tension. You're in Richard's warehouse after his conviction, watching officials distribute his hoarded flour to bakers at controlled prices. The line of bakers stretches around the block, and their relief is visible. They finally have supplies again. But you're also noticing that the quantity Richard hoarded, while significant, wasn't actually enough to cause the shortage he profited from. He was just one engrosser among many, and the officials already planning raids on other warehouses, other merchants, trying to break the back of the hoarding network that turned ordinary scarcity into catastrophic shortage. You're watching a town crier announce new regulations. Anyone possessing more than 2 months' supply of grain, flour, or bread must register with authorities and justify the quantity. Failure to register means automatic presumption of engrossing. It's an attempt to prevent future Richards from hoarding in secret, but you can already see the problems. How do you enforce this? How do you verify self-reported quantities? How do you distinguish between legitimate business inventory and criminal hoarding? The law creates as many questions as it answers, but the authorities are desperate to prevent the hunger that engrossers enable. You're in a village bakery on a morning that seems ordinary until it isn't, and you're watching a woman named Marjorie knead dough that looks slightly wrong. The flour has dark specks in it, and when you look closer you see tiny threads of something that doesn't belong. It's ergot, a fungus that grows on rye in wet years. And within weeks, everyone who eats bread from this batch will be experiencing symptoms they'll interpret not as poisoning but as witchcraft. You're about to witness how mouldy bread and spoiled grain became the bridge between food crime and accusations of dark magic. How hungry people eating contaminated food could trigger witch hunts that ended with mass executions. The connection between bad bread and witchcraft accusations isn't obvious until you understand ergot poisoning, which medieval people called St. Anthony's fire. You're watching the symptoms appear in villagers who ate Marjorie's bread: burning sensations in the limbs, convulsions, hallucinations, gangrene in severe cases. The medieval mind had no concept of fungal toxins or chemical poisoning. When people started seeing visions, writhing in pain, claiming their skin was on fire, the explanation that made sense was supernatural. Someone had cursed the bread. Someone had made a pact with dark forces. Someone was a witch. You're in Marjorie's cottage 3 weeks after she baked that contaminated bread, and a mob has gathered outside. 7 people in the village are sick with mysterious ailments. 2 children have died, and someone remembered that Marjorie was seen gathering herbs at midnight last month. She claimed she was making medicine for her husband's cough. But now people are reinterpreting everything through the lens of witchcraft. The bread, they say, was deliberately cursed. Marjorie is a witch who poisoned the village through her baking. You're watching her terrified face as she realizes that her crime of baking with mouldy flour, probably unknowingly, probably because she was too poor to throw away contaminated grain, has become a capital charge of maleficium, harmful magic. Here's the horrifying detail: the actual quality of the bread often didn't matter once accusations started. You're watching a different case now, in a different village, where a baker named Alice is accused of witchcraft after several customers became ill. Officials inspect her bakery and find nothing wrong. Her flour is clean, her methods sound, her ovens properly maintained, but the accusations don't stop because they were never really about evidence. Alice is old, unmarried, keeps cats, sometimes mutters to herself. She fits the stereotype of a witch, and once that label attaches, facts become irrelevant. The bread is just the excuse, the entry point for accusations rooted in prejudice and communal scapegoating. The prosecution of bread-related witchcraft followed patterns you're now recognizing from other food crimes, but with supernatural overtones that made them infinitely more dangerous. You're in a trial watching Marjorie defend herself, and she's trying to explain about the wet harvest season, about how the rye looked slightly darker but she didn't know it was dangerous, about how she's just a poor woman trying to feed her family. The Inquisitor isn't interested in natural explanations. He's asking her if she renounced God, if she met with the devil, if she deliberately poisoned the bread through satanic ritual. Every denial seems to make her look guiltier because the questions are designed to be unanswerable. Do you remember the earlier cases where intent mattered less than the deed itself? You're seeing that principle taken to its extreme. Even if Marjorie genuinely didn't know the flour was contaminated, even if she had no malicious intent, the fact that people got sick after eating her bread is treated as evidence of guilt. But in witchcraft cases, there's an added layer. The prosecution claims she must have known because ordinary contamination wouldn't cause such dramatic symptoms. The severity of the illness is used as proof of supernatural intervention, creating a logical trap where being a good baker who accidentally used bad flour becomes impossible. The quirky and tragic detail, some accusations came from competitors using witchcraft charges to eliminate business rivals. You're watching a case where a successful female baker is accused by a male baker who wants her customer base. Here's evidence. 3 people who bought her bread later complained of stomach upset, probably from a dozen natural causes, but he presents it as a pattern of cursed baking. The accusation alone destroys her reputation. Even when the charges are eventually dismissed for lack of evidence, she's ruined. No one will buy bread from a suspected witch. No matter how questionable the accusation, let me tell you about the trial by ordeal sometimes used in bread-related witchcraft cases. Because it reveals the impossible position of the accused. You're watching a woman named Joan who's been accused of cursing bread. The test: she must bake a loaf under supervision using blessed ingredients, and if anyone eating that loaf becomes ill, she's proven guilty. It sounds almost fair until you realise that psychosomatic illness, coincidental sickness, or even deliberate false claims by hostile witnesses could all trigger a guilty verdict. Joan bakes the loaf perfectly. A hostile witness claims stomach pain after eating it. Joan is convicted and sentenced to burn. The punishment for witchcraft was almost universally death, usually by burning, and the bread element didn't mitigate this. You're watching Marjorie's execution now, and it's one of the most horrible scenes you've witnessed in this entire journey. She's tied to a stake, still protesting her innocence, still trying to explain about the mouldy rye. And the crowd watching includes people she's known her entire life. Some look satisfied justice is being done. The witch is being purged. Others look uncertain, wondering if perhaps this has gone too far. But no one intervenes. The torch is lit, and Marjorie dies for the crime of being poor and unlucky and baking bread from contaminated grain. Historians still argue about the connection between ergot poisoning and witch trials, with some suggesting outbreaks of ergotism triggered many witch hunts, while others argue the correlation is overstated and witchcraft accusations had more complex social roots. You're seeing evidence for both positions, clear cases where bread contamination caused symptoms interpreted as bewitchment, and other cases where bread was merely a pretext for accusations rooted in gender, economics, or personal grudges. The truth is probably that contaminated bread could trigger accusations in populations already primed to believe in witchcraft, creating a deadly feedback loop. You're in a village that's lost 3 bakers to witchcraft accusations in 2 years, and the remaining bakers are terrified. They're examining their flour with obsessive care, refusing to bake if there's even a hint of contamination, sometimes destroying perfectly good grain out of pure paranoia. The witch hunts have achieved what regulations never could: absolute vigilance about bread quality, but the cost is measured in burned women and traumatized communities. You're watching a baker named Elizabeth inspect her rye, find a single grain with dark spots, and immediately burn her entire supply rather than risk even the whisper of accusation. You're back in Marjorie's village months after her execution, and people are still getting sick because the problem was never witchcraft, it was contaminated grain that half the village stored from that wet harvest. But admitting that would mean admitting they burned an innocent woman, so instead they're looking for the next witch, the next scapegoat, the next explanation that avoids the simple truth that sometimes bread is dangerous not because of curses, but because of mould. The cycle continues, and you realise that bread crimes and witchcraft accusations created a spiral where fear begat violence, begat more fear, all centred on the staff of life that could also become the instrument of death. You're holding a loaf of bread and examining the mark pressed into its crust, a distinctive stamp showing a wheat sheaf and the initials J.B. for John Baker. This mark is John's legal signature, his guarantee of quality, and his potential death warrant if anything goes wrong with this bread. But you're not looking at John's bread anymore, you're looking at a forgery. Someone has carved a wooden stamp that mimics John's mark and they're using it to sell inferior bread under his good reputation. The crime is called counterfeiting a baker's mark, and in medieval law, it was treated with the same severity as counterfeiting the king's currency. Both crimes involved fraud, both undermined trust in essential systems, and both could lead you to the gallows. The requirement that every baker mark their bread began as consumer protection, but evolved into something far more complex. You're watching a guild meeting where the system is being explained to a new master baker. Every loaf you produce must bear your unique mark, registered with the guild and the town authorities. If someone gets sick from your bread, inspectors can trace it back to you. If your bread comes up underweight, your mark identifies the guilty party. But here's the double edge: if someone counterfeits your mark and sells bad bread, you might be blamed initially. And proving your innocence requires demonstrating that the mark is forged not always easy when examining a piece of baked crust. You're in a workshop now, watching a criminal named William carve a replica of a well-regarded baker's stamp. His hands are skilled, he's actually a carpenter by trade, and the reproduction is nearly perfect. William's plan is elegant in its deception by cheap. Inferior flour, bake substandard bread, mark it with a respected baker's stamp, and sell it at premium prices. The real baker's reputation provides cover, and by the time anyone realises the bread is poor quality, William will have moved on to another mark, another victim. It's fraud layered on fraud, and the medieval authorities viewed it as an attack on the entire system of commerce. Here's where the punishment becomes interesting. You're reading court records from 1344 about a man named Thomas Mims, who was convicted of counterfeiting baker's marks in London. The sentence wasn't just a fine or imprisonment. Thomas was sentenced to stand in the pillory for 3 market days with the counterfeit stamps hung around his neck, and then to be permanently expelled from the city. The symbolic element is important. The counterfeit stamps displayed publicly as evidence of his crime. Visual proof of the fraud he attempted. But some regions went further. You're reading about a case in France where a mark counterfeiter was sentenced to have his hand branded with a hot iron, permanently marking him as a fraud in the same way he'd fraudulently marked bread. The connection to currency counterfeiting wasn't just rhetorical. Medieval authorities explicitly drew parallels. You're listening to a magistrate explain the logic. Just as the king's coin bears his mark to certify its value, so does a baker's loaf bear his mark to certify its quality. To forge either is to undermine the foundation of trust upon which all commerce depends. This wasn't hyperbole to the medieval mind. In a world where literacy was limited and people couldn't read ingredient labels or demand chemical analysis, the baker's mark was the only guarantee of origin and quality. Destroying faith in that system threatened social stability. Do you remember how guilds aggressively protected their monopolies? You're seeing that protection extend to the marking system with ferocious intensity. The Bakers' Guild didn't wait for official authorities to prosecute mark counterfeiters, they hunted them themselves. You're watching a group of guild members raid William's workshop after receiving a tip about his counterfeit stamps. They're not police. They have no official authority. But they seize William, confiscate his tools and stamps, and drag him bodily to the guild hall, where he'll face the guild's private court before ever seeing a royal magistrate. The guild's reputation is at stake, and they're not gentle with those who threaten it. The quirky detail that shows how sophisticated the system became. Some bakers began incorporating secret elements into their marks that were difficult to forge. You're examining a stamp that includes not just initials, but tiny details, specific numbers of wheat grains in the sheaf. A subtle irregularity in one letter. A miniature symbol that only appears under close inspection. These were medieval anti-counterfeiting measures, and they worked to varying degrees. But they also created new problems. Inspectors had to memorize dozens or hundreds of unique marks, distinguishing not just between bakers but between authentic and forged versions of each mark. Let me tell you about the case of Richard Rung, documented in 1364 because it reveals the human cost of mark counterfeiting. Richard was a respected baker whose mark was counterfeited by someone producing terrible bread with sawdust mixed into the flour. Several people became violently ill, and the bread was traced to Richard's mark. Richard was arrested. His bakery was seized, and he spent weeks in jail before someone finally discovered that the mark was a forgery. The wheat sheaf had 6 grains instead of 5, a detail Richard could prove by showing his official stamp. By the time he was released, his business was ruined, his reputation destroyed, and his family destitute. The counterfeiter was never caught, but Richard paid the price anyway. Historians still argue whether the marking system actually reduced fraud or simply created new opportunities for sophisticated fraud. You're seeing evidence for both positions. On one hand, marks made it easier to trace bad bread to its source and hold bakers accountable. On the other hand, marks could be forged, good bakers could be framed, and the system created a false sense of security. People trusted the mark without examining the actual bread. It's another example of a well-intentioned regulation creating complicated, sometimes perverse outcomes. You're watching the prosecution of William Now, the carpenter who carved counterfeit stamps. The evidence against him is overwhelming. They found multiple stamps in his possession, bread bearing those false marks in his home, and witnesses who saw him selling the bread at market. His defence is that he was hired by someone else to carve the stamps, that he didn't know they'd be used for fraud, that he's just a craftsman doing commissioned work. The magistrate isn't buying it. The verdict comes quickly: guilty of counterfeiting marks. The sentence: 3 days in the pillory, forfeiture of all tools, a massive fine, and permanent exile from the city and all cities within 50 miles. You're in the pillory with William Now, standing near him as he endures the punishment, and the crowd's reaction is interesting. They're angrier than you might expect for what seems like a relatively minor property crime, but you're hearing their comments and understanding their fury. He made us doubt honest bakers. One woman shouts. How can we trust any mark now? A man yells. William's crime wasn't just fraud against individual victims. It was an attack on the social infrastructure of trust that made urban life possible. In a world where you couldn't verify quality yourself, where you had to rely on markers and reputation, destroying faith in those systems was genuinely dangerous. You're watching the aftermath as guild officials destroy William's counterfeit stamps, with ceremony breaking them in public view, burning the pieces, scattering the ashes. It's ritualistic, almost religious, an exorcism of fraud. The message to other potential counterfeiters is clear: we will find you. We will destroy your tools. We will ruin your life. The guild's power was absolute within its domain, and they wielded it without mercy against those who threatened the marking system that underpinned their authority and the public's trust. You're walking through a winter night so cold that frost glitters on the cobblestones like scattered diamonds, and you're following a shadow that moves from doorway to doorway, trying to stay hidden. The shadow is a man named Peter, and he hasn't eaten in 3 days. He's not a criminal by nature. 6 months ago, he had a job as a farmhand, a place to sleep, a reason to wake each morning. But the harvest failed. His employer couldn't afford to keep him, and now Peter is what medieval law calls a vagrant, a person without employment, without a fixed residence, without legal standing in any community. You're watching him approach a baker's window where yesterday's unsold bread sits on a shelf inside, and you know what's about to happen will define whether Peter survives the week or dies before it ends. The crime of vagrancy itself could get you arrested, whipped, branded, or expelled from town even before you stole anything. You're reading the Statute of Labourers from 1349, passed after the Black Death created labour shortages, and authorities panicked about workers moving between towns seeking better wages. The law required every able-bodied person to work, to stay in their home parish, to accept employment at fixed wages. If you were found travelling without employment, without a letter from your last employer, without visible means of support, you were presumed to be a criminal vagrant. The punishment started with being returned to your home parish, which sounds mild, until you realise that if your home parish couldn't support you, you'd starve there legally rather than elsewhere illegally. You're watching Peter reach through the window. It's not locked. Security was different then, and grab a single loaf of bread is probably worth a penny, maybe 2, in modern terms. He's shoplifting something worth a few dollars. In medieval terms, he's committed a theft that, combined with his vagrant status, could lead directly to the gallows. You can see his hands shaking as he clutches the bread, and you understand he knows the risk, but hunger has made the choice for him. Humans can endure many things, but prolonged starvation erodes the will to care about consequences. The enforcement of vagrancy laws was often brutal and immediate. You're watching the baker discover his missing loaf at dawn and immediately sound an alarm. Within minutes, a group of men is searching the area, and they find Peter huddled in the stable. The evidence of the stolen bread still in his hands. He couldn't bring himself to eat it all at once, trying to make it last. The men drag him to the town bailiff, and you're hearing the charges accumulate: vagrancy, theft, breaking and entering. Each charge layers onto the others, and together they paint Peter not as a desperate, hungry man, but as a dangerous criminal threatening social order. Here's the tragic mathematics of bread and vagrancy. The punishment for stealing bread, while vagrant, was often far harsher than for stealing bread if you had a fixed residence and employment. You're in a courtroom watching 2 cases heard consecutively. First, a stable resident baker's apprentice who stole a loaf is fined and sentenced to a day in the pillory. Second, Peter the vagrant who stole an identical loaf is sentenced to be hanged. The disparity seems monstrous until you understand the medieval logic. The apprentice has a place in society, can be reformed, has a master who'll vouch for him. Peter has nothing, represents the chaos of people untethered from social structures, and must be removed to protect order. Do you remember the 3-strike system we discussed earlier? It barely applied to vagrants. You're reading statutes that specify first offence vagrants should be whipped and sent back to their home parish. Second offence meant branding a V burned into the shoulder so they'd be permanently marked. Third offence meant death. But sometimes authorities skipped straight to execution if the vagrancy was combined with other crimes like theft. Peter is both vagrant and thief, and the magistrate is looking at him with the cold calculation of someone deciding whether this human life has any value to society. The quirky and heartbreaking detail some vagrants deliberately committed crimes in order to be imprisoned because prison meant food and shelter, however miserable. You're listening to a vagrant woman named Joan openly confess to stealing bread, almost boasting about it, because she knows a few months in prison will get her through the worst of winter. She's made a survival calculation brief imprisonment is better than slow starvation. The magistrate seems to understand what she's doing and responds by sentencing her to whipping and immediate expulsion from town rather than imprisonment. He won't let her game the system, even if refusing means she'll likely die. Let me tell you about the economics of vagrant bread theft, because it created impossible situations. You're watching a baker whose shop is near the city gates, a location that attracts vagrants because they're passing through. He loses perhaps 1 loaf per week to theft, which seems minor until you calculate that over a year. It's 50 loaves, which is weeks of profit, which could mean the difference between his family eating well or struggling. He can't afford to absorb these losses, so he installs better locks, keeps bread away from windows, watches every customer suspiciously. His security measures protect him but harden the barrier between food and the hungry, making desperate acts by vagrants more likely and more dangerous. Historians still argue whether harsh vagrancy laws actually reduced homelessness and crime, or simply made life impossibly brutal for the most vulnerable. You're seeing evidence for both perspectives. The laws did create pressure for people to maintain employment and fixed residences, to stay within established social structures, but they also created a category of people who, once labelled vagrant, found it nearly impossible to re-enter legitimate society. Peter has been branded, you're watching the iron pressed to his shoulder, the smell of burning flesh, his screams, and now no one will hire him. How can he stop being vagrant if his vagrant status prevents employment? The system creates the problem it claims to solve. You're watching Peter after his sentencing. He received branding and expulsion rather than hanging, a mercy of sorts as he limps out of town at nightfall. He's been forbidden to return on pain of death. But the next town will likely do the same when they see his brand, and the town after that. He's becoming a perpetual wanderer not by choice, but because the law has made settled life impossible for him. You wonder how long until he steals another loaf, gets caught again, and this time faces the gallows he narrowly avoided. The connection between bread crimes and vagrancy reveals something profound about medieval justice. It punished poverty almost as severely as it punished violence. You're seeing that a poor person who steals food to survive faces consequences similar to someone who commits assault or robbery with intent to profit. The law didn't distinguish much between need and greed, between survival crime and a predatory crime. Theft was theft, and if you were vagrant, you'd already demonstrated your failure to maintain your proper place in society, which made you dangerous regardless of motivation. You're in a church now, listening to a priest explain the parable of feeding the hungry, and the irony is overwhelming. Christianity teaches charity to the poor, yet Christian kingdoms execute people for stealing bread to avoid starvation. The priest is arguing that private charity is virtuous, but theft is always sin, that God will provide for those who have faith. But you're looking at the congregation and seeing Peter's brand on the shoulders of several people, and you wonder how they reconcile divine promises with earthly hunger, how they maintain faith when the choice is between sin and starvation. You're standing at a crossroads where 3 kingdoms meet, and you're about to discover that stepping 20 feet in any direction could mean the difference between a fine and an execution for exactly the same bread crime. Medieval Europe wasn't a unified legal system, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, principalities, and free cities, each with its own approach to regulating bread, and the variations were sometimes merciful, sometimes bizarrely creative, and sometimes absolutely terrifying. You're watching a baker pack his cart to move from England to France, and he's asking a travelling merchant about bread laws in Paris because getting this wrong could cost him everything. The German territories generally took a more measured approach to bread crimes than their neighbours. You're in a Frankfurt bakery watching an inspection that would seem familiar from England, the weighing, the quality check. The examination of the baker's mark, but the punishment schedule is different. First offence for underweight bread brings a warning and a small fine. Second offence brings a larger fine and temporary suspension from the guild. It's only the third offence that brings serious corporal punishment or expulsion. The German authorities seem to recognise that bakers were craftsmen who might make honest mistakes, and the punishment should match the pattern of behaviour rather than the single act. But travel south to Italy and you're entering a different world entirely. You're in Venice now, where the Merchant Republic has developed elaborate bread regulations that focus as much on public health as on weight and price. Venetian inspectors test for adulteration, mixing cheaper grains into expensive flour, adding sawdust or chalk to stretch supplies. The punishment for adulteration is particularly theatrical. You're watching a convicted baker being forced to wear a tall hat made of stale bread while being paraded through the market square. It's humiliating without being physically brutal, and historians still argue whether this represents enlightened punishment or simply a different flavour of cruelty. You're in Spain now, where the intersection of Christian, Muslim and Jewish communities created unique complications for bread regulation. Different religious groups had different bread requirements: unleavened bread for Passover, specific preparation methods for kosher baking, halal considerations for Muslim bakers. You're watching an inspector struggle to apply standard bread weight regulations to a Jewish baker whose religious obligations require different bread forms. The solution in some Spanish cities was to have separate regulations for different religious communities, which sounds tolerant until you realise it also meant religious minorities could be prosecuted for violating regulations they didn't even know applied to them. Here's the fascinating detail about France: the French authorities were often the harshest in Europe regarding bread crimes. You're reading records from 14th century Paris, and the penalties make English law look almost merciful. A baker convicted of selling underweight bread twice could be sentenced to the pillory for a week, not a day. Third offence brought not just guild expulsion, but sometimes public flogging severe enough to be life-threatening. The French crown saw bread regulation as essential to preventing the urban riots that periodically shook Paris, and they enforced bread laws with an intensity that reflected genuine fear of mob violence. Do you remember the ducking stool for female bakers and alewives in England? You're seeing regional variations on this punishment that range from almost comical to genuinely deadly. In some German towns, the ducking was literally a quick dip, uncomfortable and humiliating but relatively safe. In parts of France, you're watching a woman being repeatedly submerged until she's choking and gasping, held under just long enough to create terror without quite drowning her. The same punishment name. Wildly different severity depending on which magistrate in which town decided to enforce it. The quirky regional variation that's almost charming in its strangeness: some Swiss cantons required bakers who violated weight regulations to personally deliver free bread to the poor for a month. You're watching a baker named Hans fulfill this sentence, going door to door in the poorest quarter of town, handing out loaves while explaining that he's doing this because he cheated the weight. It's restorative justice avant la lettre. The baker pays his debt to society by feeding those most harmed by his fraud, and the community sees concrete recompense rather than abstract punishment. Whether this actually reformed bakers better than the pillory is impossible to know, but it certainly created less violence. Let me tell you about the Scottish approach, which differed from English law in interesting ways. You're in Edinburgh watching a bread trial. and the proceedings have a different character. The Scottish courts seemed more willing to consider circumstances. Was the harvest bad? Were grain prices unusually high? Did the baker have a previous good reputation? You're seeing a baker argue that his slightly underweight loaves were an honest mistake during a week when his apprentice was sick and he was overwhelmed with work. The magistrate accepts this explanation and sentences him only to a warning and a tiny fine. The same case in London might have meant the pillory. But don't assume Scotland was uniformly lenient. You're watching another case where a baker is convicted of deliberately mixing sawdust into flour during a famine, and the sentence is savage public whipping, branding, and permanent exile. The Scottish system seemed to distinguish more carefully between honest mistakes and deliberate fraud, between first-time offenders and repeat criminals, between crimes of desperation and crimes of greed. Whether this made it more just or simply more complicated is something historians still debate. You're in the Low Countries now, modern Belgium and Netherlands, where the prosperous trading cities developed their own approaches. Bruges had inspectors who seemed almost obsessed with bread colour and texture, with regulations specifying not just weight but the acceptable range of crust darkness and crumb consistency. You're watching an inspector reject an entire batch of bread not because it's underweight but because it's too brown, suggesting the baker used inferior flour or over-baked to hide poor ingredients. The punishment is confiscation and a fine, but notably not corporal punishment. The Flemish merchants seem to prefer economic penalties over physical ones, perhaps because their trading culture made them more comfortable with fines and confiscation. Historians still argue about why these regional variations existed and what they reveal about different medieval societies. You're seeing evidence that German territories, with their strong guild traditions, developed more graduated punishment systems. French kingdoms, with their history of urban riots, enforced bread laws most harshly. Italian city-states, with their merchant cultures, created creative public shaming rituals. English law fell somewhere in the middle, harsh but not the harshest. The variations suggest that bread law reflected each society's deepest fears. Germans feared disorder in craft systems. French feared mob violence. Italians feared loss of commercial reputation. You're back at that crossroads now, and the travelling baker has decided to stay in Germany rather than risk French regulations. He's heard too many stories about the Paris pillories, about inspectors who show no mercy, about the way French authorities treat bread crimes almost like treason. The German system, with its warnings and graduated penalties, feels safer even if the guild fees are higher. You're watching him unpack his cart, abandon his migration plans, and settle for the devil he knows rather than risk the devils he doesn't. It's a small decision by one person, but multiply it across thousands of bakers and you see how regional legal variations shaped population movement, economic development, and the daily texture of medieval life. You're standing in a courtroom in 1772 and something feels different. The magistrate is still hearing a bread case, a baker accused of selling underweight loaves, but the language has changed. The tone has shifted, and when the sentence comes down, it's just a modest fine with no mention of pillories or brandings or executions. You're witnessing the slow death of medieval bread law, a transformation that took centuries and happened so gradually that no single moment marks the change. The baker leaves the courtroom annoyed but not terrified, and you realise that somewhere in the previous 100 years, bread stopped being a matter of life and death and became merely a matter of commerce. The decline of draconian bread laws didn't happen because authorities suddenly became more merciful. You're watching the factors accumulate improvements in agriculture that made famine less frequent. The growth of international trade that meant bread shortages in one region could be offset by imports from another. The rise of market economics that made price controls increasingly unworkable. And perhaps, Most importantly, the slow erosion of the rigid social hierarchies that medieval bread laws were designed to maintain. When society itself began transforming from feudal structures to early capitalism, the laws governing bread had to transform too. You're in England in 1815 reading the final repeal of the Assize of bread that had governed baking for over 500 years. The language of repeal is telling. Parliament argues that the Assize has become burdensome and unnecessary, that bakers should be free to charge what the market will bear. That competition will ensure quality better than regulation ever did. You're seeing the birth of free market ideology applied to bread. And while it sounds liberating, you're also noticing that within months, bread prices in poor neighbourhoods spike because without price controls, bakers charge whatever desperate people will pay. Here's the fascinating transition period for decades. Old laws remained on the books but were enforced sporadically or not at all. You're watching an 1830s inspector find underweight bread but decide the violation isn't worth prosecuting because everyone does it, and the courts rarely convict anymore. The law hasn't changed, but social consensus around enforcement has collapsed. You're seeing one of those historical moments where formal law and actual practice diverge so dramatically that the law becomes almost fictional, existing in statute books but nowhere else. Do you remember all those specific crimes for stalling, engrossing, unlicensed baking, mark counterfeiting? You're watching them disappear from court records one by one through the 18th and 19th centuries. Not because the behaviour stopped, but because they were being reclassified as civil matters rather than criminal ones, or because new economic theories argued they weren't harmful at all. A merchant buying up grain before it reached market wasn't a forestaller anymore, he was a commodities trader, an essential part of market efficiency. The language changed, and with it, the moral weight of the action. The guild monopolies crumbled under similar pressures. You're watching the worshipful company of bakers in London gradually lose their power to exclude non-members from baking. First, enforcement became lax. Then, courts started ruling in favour of unlicensed bakers who challenged guild authority. Finally, the guilds transformed from regulatory bodies into social clubs and charitable organisations, maintaining their fancy halls and ceremonial dinners, but losing all power to control who could bake or what they could charge. The monopoly was broken not by revolution, but by 1,000 small erosions of authority. But some echoes of medieval bread law survived longer than you might expect. You're in early 20th century England, and there are still laws on the books requiring bread to be sold in specific weights: £1, £2, £4, no odd sizes allowed. The rationale sounds medieval standardisation protects consumers from being cheated by confusing weight variations. The punishment for violations is just a fine now, nothing corporal. But the fundamental principle remains: bread is too important to leave entirely unregulated. You're seeing the ghost of the Assize of bread haunting industrial bakeries. Let me tell you about the transition in punishment philosophy, because this reveals broader changes in how Western societies thought about justice. You're watching an 1850s trial of a baker who sold adulterated bread mixed with alum to make it whiter and heavier. In medieval times, he might have been pilloried or branded. Now, he's sentenced to 3 months in a reformatory prison, with the explicit goal of rehabilitation rather than punishment. The language of the sentence emphasises that he'll receive education and training to become an honest tradesman. Whether the reformatory actually accomplished this is debatable, but the shift in official philosophy is significant. The quirky survival of bread law into modernity, some localities maintained bread price controls well into the 20th century, particularly during wars and economic crises. You're in 1940s Britain, watching the government set maximum bread prices and prosecute bakers who charge more, justified by wartime emergency. Is the Assize of bread reborn in modern form? and some of the oldest bakers remember their grandfathers talking about the old Assize system. The same principle government must ensure affordable bread or risk social unrest resurfaces whenever crisis makes food security precarious. Historians still argue about whether the medieval bread laws were fundamentally unjust or represented the best possible approach to managing food security in pre-modern societies. You're seeing evidence for both positions throughout this entire journey. The laws were brutal, often arbitrary, frequently applied unfairly based on wealth and social position. But they also prevented some famines from becoming catastrophic, deterred some fraud, and maintained baseline standards when no other mechanism existed. Perhaps the fairest assessment is that they were simultaneously necessary and monstrous, born from genuine social needs but implemented with medieval brutality. You're in a modern supermarket now, and the journey from medieval bakery to this fluorescent-lit abundance feels almost impossible. The bread here has ingredient labels regulated by food safety agencies, nutrition information mandated by law, expiration dates enforced by health departments. You can't be executed for baking anymore, but you can be sued, fined, shut down, prosecuted for food safety violations. The medieval authorities would recognise the impulse society still regulates bread because bread still matters, but the methods have been sanitised, bureaucratised, removed from public squares and placed in courtrooms and regulatory agencies. Yet some threads connect then to now more directly than you'd expect. You're reading a modern news story about a baker sued for short-waiting organic bread selling loaves labelled as £1 that actually weighed 14 ounces. The penalty is just a fine and corrective advertising, nothing medieval. But the principle is identical. Bakers must deliver the weight they promise. And society will enforce that requirement. The medieval inspector with his bronze scales would understand this case perfectly, even if the modern regulatory apparatus would baffle him. You're thinking back through this entire journey now, through pillories and executions, through guild wars and witch trials, through forestalling and engrossing, through vagrant thieves and counterfeit marks, and you're struck by a simple truth. Bread was never just bread, it was power, it was survival, it was the foundation of social order, and threatening it was threatening everything. Medieval people understood viscerally that civilization was a thin crust over chaos, and bread was the mortar holding that crust together. Break the bread laws, and you broke the fragile consensus that kept everyone fed and relatively peaceful. The legacy of medieval bread law isn't found in specific statutes that survived. Most were repealed centuries ago. It's found in the assumption, so deep we barely notice it, that food is different from other commodities, that society has the right and duty to regulate it, that some things are too essential to leave entirely to individual choice or market forces. Every modern food safety regulation, every nutritional labelling requirement, every health inspection of a restaurant kitchen carries the DNA of those medieval inspectors weighing loaves in market squares, enforcing rules they believed kept their world from starving. You're watching the sunset now, soft light through the window, and your thoughts are growing slower, more peaceful. The medieval world with all its harsh justice is fading into history where it belongs, and you're safe in a time when bread is abundant and mostly safe, and no one will execute you for weighing errors. The pillories are gone, the ducking stools rotted away, the gallows torn down. What remains is the understanding that food matters, that fairness matters, that society has always struggled to balance individual freedom with collective survival. The methods changed, became more humane, but the fundamental challenge, how do we ensure everyone gets their daily bread, remains as relevant now as it was when those medieval bakers first stamped their marks into crusty loaves on foggy market mornings 700 years ago. The strange laws of medieval bread seem almost impossible from our comfortable modern distance. don't they? But they reveal something essential about human societies in every era. We've always known that food is more than nutrition. It's the foundation of everything else. And when that foundation crumbles, everything crumbles with it. The medieval authorities understood this with a clarity born from living much closer to the edge of survival than we do now. Their methods were harsh, often cruel, sometimes monstrously unjust, but beneath the brutality was a genuine attempt to prevent the collapse into famine and chaos that they'd witnessed over and over throughout their lives. As you drift towards sleep now, let yourself release the weight of all those medieval struggles, all that anxiety and hunger and fear. You don't have to carry it. You're here, now, in a world where bread is abundant and food safety is measured in laboratory tests rather than public executions. The bakers who were pilloried, the vagrants who were hanged, the women who were ducked and burned, their suffering is over. Their stories remembered, but their pain ended. You can rest now, knowing that for all our modern problems, at least no one will come for you in the night because you baked a loaf 2 ounces underweight. The medieval world is safely in the past, and you're safely in the present, warm and comfortable, drifting on gentle waves toward peaceful sleep. Let the story settle softly in your mind like flour falling through a sieve, the harsh parts filtered out, leaving only the fascinating strangeness of it all. People in every era do the best they can with what they understand, and medieval people understood that bread was life, and life was precious. And precious things must be protected even if the protection itself becomes harsh. There's something almost touching in that, in the fierce determination to keep everyone fed, even when the methods were flawed and cruel. They cared enough to try, at least, even when they failed. Sleep well now, and may your dreams be filled not with medieval market squares but with peaceful fields of wheat, golden in summer sun, grain swaying in gentle breezes, the promise of abundance without fear, of bread enough for everyone, of a world where no one goes hungry and no one faces the gallows for the simple human need to eat. Good night, and rest easy, knowing those strange medieval laws are safely confined to history books and bedtime stories. Interesting to contemplate, but no longer dangerous. Fascinating, but no longer frightening. Strange, but no longer threatening. Sweet dreams.